When I welcomed a stranger during the storm, my life took an unexpected turn. The roof of the house rattled like an old man coughing. Rain came down in sheets, smacking the dirt road, running in little rivers through the ruts that led to the barn. October had a way of dressing the nights in a hurry, as if the calendar wanted the world to edge in toward smaller, darker things. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee so cold it tasted like apology. The lamp threw a circle of orange over the bills and the photo of my wife I'd kept propped against the sugar jar. Her face had softened to memory, the edges worn. I had been practicing a kind of quiet that came from staying inside one grief for too long. It was the knock on the gate that startled me more than the storm, a hard, wet knock, almost like someone had a piece of wood and kept calling to be noticed. I stood because my bones know how to. I opened the door, and there he was, soaked into his coat that it looked painted on, boots mud-stiff, hair plastered. He had a lantern by his hand and a way of looking at you like he'd been listening from the weather itself. "You got a roof I could borrow?" he asked. Ordinary words, not much else. Ordinary words can be trouble. I studied him for a long second. Then the farmer's habit took over. I measured risk and hospitality in one glance. You feed someone and you've made them part of your life, even if only for a night. I had less to offer than I used to. A home quieter than it should be. An old truck that coughed, and a barn full of tools I rarely used. My wife used to say I was lucky at hospitality. She liked the clatter and company. After she died, the house shrunk. The barn kept more of my breath. "All right," I said. I think my voice surprised me. It was not proud, only automatic, the old reflex of not leaving a man in a storm. "There's a dry corner in the loft. Hay'll do." He smiled like he'd expected the answer. He shrugged out of his coat and walked like a man who had decided to belong to the wet night. I closed the gate behind him and watched him move toward the barn. His coat left dark footprints on the gravel that the rain tried to erase. If you'd asked me then what I expected, I would have said nothing. I expected a night of silence filled with the storm's noise. I expected to wake with a harder jaw and the same list of small resentments. The neighbor who never mowed his side, the market prices, the ache in my knee. For years I had been rehearsing grievances like liturgy. You know the drill. The mind finds its grooves. You remind yourself of everything that's wrong and you pile it into the morning. Always, always, I'd say in the privacy of my head. Always something. The barn smelled of wet hay and oil. The lantern painted him in slow light. His face asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. He moved with a sort of ease I'd lost. Something that wasn't hurried or anxious, just present. We didn't speak much the first night. He made a place for himself in the loft and I went back to the house, the cold coffee, the picture of Martha. In the dark I tried not to think about how long it had been since my son Nathan and my daughter Sarah had been inside this kitchen together. I tried not to count the times I'd said to myself that it was their fault, that my grief was a book and they'd each written a page that left out my name. Habit, not truth. Habit, not God. You talk about things you don't want. That's what he said to me, months later, simple as a cough. But I'm getting ahead of myself. On the second night, he came down from the loft with the same quiet as before. Rain had slowed to a persistent whisper. I handed him a mug. I'd warmed the coffee even if I hated how it tasted. And he accepted it like a man taking a moment from the world. "You're a farmer?" he asked. He spoke as if he listened to the land like a radio. There wasn't curiosity in the way most people ask. There was recognition. "Yes." I said it like a badge more than an answer. "Used to take care of this place with my wife. Martha, she kept the light." "Keepers of light," he repeated. "Hard work." I bristled. People pity you without meaning to, and it's quick to turn to annoyance. I answered with the usual things. The list of small failures, the market, the fence that needed mending, the ache that wouldn't leave. I went at it with the competence of someone used to rehearsing the same arguments. He listened. He did not interrupt. Maybe it was the way rain amplifies everything. Maybe it was just his face. He had eyes that seemed to be made to take in the weather. After a stretch, he said something that caught me off guard. "You talk a lot about what could go wrong." It wasn't sharp, it wasn't cruel. It landed like a truth you've been stepping on in the dark and suddenly realizes your shoe. "What?" I said, defensive before the word left my mouth. I could feel the old reflexes. I could tell you I was ready for a sermon and I wasn't. I was ready for company. I was ready for a fire. I was not ready to be read. He set his mug down. "Do you notice when something works?" I laughed. It was a small, ugly sound. "Works?" I said. "Well, things break more than they work." He shook his head. "When the tractor starts, do you notice and say, 'Thank God it started,' or do you say, 'Well, it's about time it started,' and move on to the next problem?" I remember the exact way the lantern light caught on a nail head in the beam above us. I remember the smell of oil. The barn felt suddenly focused, like a room that had been rearranged without my consent. I'd never thought of it like that, marking moments when the world cooperates. I had trained myself to be on the lookout for the next thing to go wrong. It's a useful habit if your job is to keep the place upright. It keeps you alert. It also makes life a ledger of disappointments. He didn't scold me. He offered a challenge instead. "Don't repeat the same words," he said. His voice was steady. "For 3 days, find one thing that isn't wrong every time a complaint starts to rise." Simple instruction. Ridiculously low risk. A test for a man like me that sounded frankly like a child's game, but in the way he said it, there was no pressure. He said it like something to try on. "Try it," he said. "See what changes. You can tell yourself anything when you're alone in a barn, even that you won't do what a stranger asks. The farm has long answers to loners. It teaches you that you can fix most things by yourself, and that people leave when they're done." I told myself I'd humor him. I told myself I'd forget by morning. I told myself 1,000 sensible things. Yet I also remember a thin inside part of me that wanted to be different. A part that had been tired of the repetitious grammar of grievance. That night, in the bed I'd slept in alone for 3 years, I turned the idea over like a coin. The coin had the edge of Martha's laugh on one side and Nathan's last visit on the other. I slept hard and dreamt of a tree in full leaf when October had no right to show it. The 3 days were not heroic. They were mostly awkward stitches in an old coat. On the first day I kept forgetting. I walked into the barn and thought, "Tractor's a pain today," and then remembered the stranger's face in the loft and he slowed me down. I caught myself mid-complaint and instead looked at the tractor. It was covered in muck, yes. But the thought that pushed against the complaint was small and ridiculous. The engine started. It coughed, and then it turned over. I said, "Good," aloud, like a man who had rediscovered a sensible ritual. Nobody heard me but the hens and a gull somewhere out by the river. Saying it, actually noting the thing that worked, felt unfamiliar, a muscle I hadn't used. On the second day, when the fence post finally gave and took the wind's surrender, I didn't launch into the litany about the neighbor who never helped. I fixed the post, grabbed the hammer, and I noticed that the hammer was the exact weight my hand wanted. The head fit the handle like it had been waiting. I said to myself, "That fits." The smallness of it made me laugh. It felt like finding a clean fork at the bottom of a drawer you'd already decided was empty. On the third day I nearly failed. There was a phone call, a wrong number that made me angry. And then the tractor wouldn't start on a slope and every old assumption wanted to sprint out of me at once. I felt the words gather, the script of complaint like a rehearsed line. I stopped. I felt ridiculous. Then I remembered his face and the way the lantern had made the nailhead look important. I put my hand on the tractor's wheel, felt the stubborn metal cool under my palm, and I said, "She started." "Odishurkium." It was the most straightforward phrase. It was true. When you do something simple a few times, you discover a little dignity in the doing. It's like folding clean sheets. You accomplish a small geometry and some order returns. I felt less prickly at the edges. Sleep came a little deeper those nights. My back hurt the same way, but the way I woke shifted. Instead of rehearsing the ways the day would annoy me, I caught myself cataloging what had cooperated. On the morning of the fourth day, I expected the stranger to still be there. The loft was empty. The hay was slightly tamped, as if someone had moved through it. My heart did that little animal scamper of disappointment. Then I found the note on the kitchen table, folded neat and weighted by a screwdriver. The kind you keep in the drawer and forget until you need it. The note was short. The handwriting was plain. It looked like a man who'd practiced longhand for patience rather than flourish. It said simply, "I am a mirror. I came to reflect what you needed to see." I read it 3 times, not because the words were hard, but because the way someone can leave a thing for you to find feels like an invitation into a mystery. Underneath the note, the screwdriver felt warmer than the others, like someone had held it in their hands. I took the note out to the barn and set it on the beam where the lantern had hung. In the corners of the barn light, the tools looked cleaner. Not brand new, not miraculous, just polished, as if someone had taken time to notice their worth. On the ground outside the barn, there was another sign that stayed with me. The old crabapple tree that had been dead at the crown for as long as my memory would stretch had little green nodes along a few branches. Tiny. A stubbornness of life in the October wind. I stood there and felt a humility in front of it I'd forgotten I had. Surprise. The soft kind that feels like gratitude. I'm not telling you this to hand you a lesson. I'm telling you because I want you to know how little things can be the doorway to larger rooms. The note and the gleaming tools and the buds on a tree didn't fix my loneliness. They weren't a miracle in the way some people talk about miracles on radio shows. No handout, no fanfare. They were more of a corridor of possibility, a mirror held up to a man who'd stopped practicing noticing. He'd left a small line under the mirror thing, too. Try it for 30 days if you would like to see more. No pressure. No dates. No cost. Simple as a farmer's ledger. I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I made a promise to myself. I told nobody. I set a start date for the next morning. You can laugh at the solemnity of such a thing. A 30-day practice sounds quaint compared to the crises I'd made of my life. But promises can be like seeds. They don't look like much at first. Before I go further, I should slow down and put something plain in front of you. If this story lands on you, if any part of it feels like a click in a lock you've kept closed, try what he asked me. For 3 days, when a complaint starts, when the knee aches, when a neighbor lets you down, when the bill looks taller than the weather, stop. Find one thing that isn't wrong. Say it out loud if you have to. This isn't a promise of miracles. It's an experiment. It's small, and that's why it works. Try it for 3 days and see if something shifts. I almost didn't. You might almost not either. Do it anyway. The 30 days I committed to weren't dramatic in the beginning. Day 1 after the stranger left, I woke and fixed the coffee like a man who remembers how to perform small rituals. I thanked God. Quietly. Not like any kind of sermon. It was a habit of saying thanks. I'd learned it long ago, standing at the bedside of someone you love. The sound of my own voice saying thank you felt both odd and right. By day 5, Nathan called. I hadn't been expecting it. He's stubborn in ways I understand too well. Stubborn like he thinks apology is fragile glass that will shatter if handled without gloves. I'd been waiting for the big reckoning, the conversation with all the old hurts front and center. I braced myself for it, feeling the old coils of complaint tighten. When he said, "Hi, Dad," my first instinct was to list the ways he'd been absent. I felt the complaint form. I could feel the line at the back of my throat. I remembered the stranger's lantern and the nail head in the beam. I took a breath. "You sound good," I said instead. The phrase surprised me. Nathan's silence softened. He told me about a woman at his work who'd taught his toddler to count in a silly voice. He laughed in a way he hadn't shared over the phone in months. We talked about small things. He came by the next day, longer than expected. We sat on the back steps with a thermos of coffee and didn't do anything urgent. He stayed past before dark, It's not like we fixed everything. He still had reasons to be upset. I still had reasons to be offended. But the practice had slipped into the way I listened. I was less quick to stockpile complaints. I noticed his shoes, the way his hair had begun to gray at the temple, the laugh line that made his face look friendlier. Noticing those things didn't erase hurt, but it gave me another tool in the conversation. When we argued, which we did, you can't reconcile everything in a single afternoon. I tried to notice what went right. That turned the arguing into something else, less like a trap door and more like a doorway you could step through and then decide whether to close. By day 7, the neighbors were doing what neighbors had always done, living their lives 5 feet away. Tom and Marcus came by to borrow a wrench and ended up helping me repair a sag in the east fence. I didn't complain about the nails or the weather. For once I said, "That fits," when a post went in straight. Tom laughed and said I was becoming philosophical on him. Marcus just worked. They left with a bag of Martha's jam that I'd been giving away. Half of it because she'd made too much and we'd never get through it. Half of it because giving the jars away felt like handing out small ceremonies. Sleep improved. I say that carefully. My sleep didn't become something clinical. It became deeper in the way a pond looks deeper on a calm day. The waking was less sharp with projection. Before the stranger, I would be awake 50 ways before the dawn, drafting the complaints of the day. Now I woke and said, "The kettle's working," or "The light came in," and then got up. The physical aches didn't vanish. The heartache didn't resolve itself overnight. But my mornings were less crowded with fear and anticipation of trouble. The barn kept making its small punctuation marks. Tools would be in a place I'd never leave them, but somebody had polished them and set them back. The polish wasn't like some supernatural shiny, it was more like a hand had passed slowly over the metal and left it ready for use. I would catch myself running a thumb along a spade and think of the stranger's handwriting. "I am a mirror," and the tree kept at its small stubborn business. Buds swelled as if fed by a different calendar. I'd stand beneath it in the cold and watch the sky for reasons I couldn't entirely name. Part of me wanted to be scientific about it. Pollination, microclimate, the old roots making a last claim. Part of me wanted to let it be a sign. The two things can live in the same man if you let them. There were days of resistance. Old habits are veteran soldiers. They do not give ground without a fight. On day 11, I nearly exploded at a mechanic who took too long to return a call. The words lined up like hens behind a fence. I felt them ready. I stopped and said instead, "Thanks for your work." It was awkward. The mechanic sounded surprised. He apologized with an honesty I almost hadn't expected. Later that day, a neighbor I'd had a fence feud with pulled up with a loaf of bread and asked if I needed help hauling hay. I didn't say, "About time." I said, "I could use a hand." He stayed half an hour. We mended a corner of the barn between us, and then sat on the tailgate while the sun did that late fall thing that makes things glow. The practice began to feel less like a restraint, and more like a discipline. Not a religious discipline or a new creed, just a way of pointing your flashlight around the room. You find out what's been in the corners. You find out that there are more edges to the world than the ones you keep complaining about. And yet some things didn't change. Sarah didn't call. Her silence was a kind of persistent weather. I would catch myself making reasons for it. She's busy. She's hurt. She's angry. All of them might be true. I practiced noticing the good even there. The fact that the porch light was still on, that her name on my phone didn't make it explode with bitterness the way it used to. I kept a picture of her when she was small on the shelf, and many nights I'd find myself touching the frame and naming something that worked. That smile, I'd say. It didn't fix the distance. It didn't bring her back. But naming saved me from letting the absence calcify into something uglier. I am telling you these details because the change was mostly made of small moments, not one headline miracle. The stranger did not hand me a map or a cure. He handed me a mirror, a reflection of a habit. He showed me, in 3 nights, by the light of a lantern, a way to look without immediately constructing the worst possible end. He taught me a practice I could carry into days. Toward the middle of the 2nd week, things in the neighborhood began to feel different. not because the people had changed into new saints, but because I had changed where I stood relative to them. The same song, different rhythm. The mail came with the bills and with a postcard from an old friend. A gleam in the barn caught my eye, and I went to see if, by chance, someone else had come through the night. Once, I would have thought I'd conjured these things. Now I thought of them as signs. Validation, maybe, not proof. There was a late afternoon, the kind of light that makes wood look like honey, when I went out to check the crabapple tree and found a small green fruit the size of my thumb. It was no orchard-bursting harvest. It was a modest, stubborn thing that had no reason, by all the sensible measures, to be there. I cupped it in my hand and felt a warmth that was more about recognition than anything else. I did not eat it then. I set it on the windowsill and watched the light through it for a long while. That night, I stood on the back step with a mug and watched the stars. The house was quiet. The barn hummed in the way it always had, the hay settling, the nails listening. I found myself saying thank you aloud. Not a proclamation, just an acknowledgement. It felt honest, and then, as the days began to stack toward the end of my first month, I felt the pull of the bigger questions. Was this the beginning of something long? Was I building a habit or clinging to a temporary light? Had something mysterious actually come through my gate, or had I finally decided to notice what was already there? The stranger's note was still in my drawer. I read the line again. I am a mirror. I came to reflect what you needed to see. There is a particular fear about committing to a practice like that. The fear is that you will change and then find out that the world does not change with you. Or worse, you will be disappointed that the world does change and you are the only one who notices. I carried that fear like a pocket knife. It was practical. It was useful. It made me cautious and kept me checking my reasons. On the morning the tree showed a second small swell of fruit, Nathan stopped by with Emily, his little girl, on his hip. She ran to the crabapple like a pilgrim and laughed when she saw the green thumb-sized promise on the sill. She didn't care about timing or explanation. She reached up and took the fruit and put it into her mouth with the reverence of a child. She chewed slowly, and then made the face children make when discovering sweetness for the first time. "That's good," she said around a mouthful. We all laughed. The sound in which my house had been empty for so long and, suddenly, when it came, felt like a remedy I didn't know how to name. Nathan stayed. We fixed a sagging gate together, and then he stayed for dinner. The conversation slipped into the old grooves and out again. We argued a little about the best way to plant garlic, and then we told stories about Martha, and then we paid the check of the day's weather and went to bed content. I would be lying if I said the rest of the month was easy. I fought my reflexes constantly. I had mornings where the complaint nearly tripped me, and I had to stop and hold my tongue like a man who had smoked too long and finally quit. There were nights when I still woke from dreams of Martha and felt like the world had left me unpaid. The practice was not a balm that erased grief. It was a scaffold I could hold on to when the wind wanted to fall me down. It is strange the way gratitude and noticing can feel like both a refusal and a surrender. Part of me feared that naming the good was betraying the hard edges I'd learned to live with. Another part felt like it was finally learning to set a table again. The stranger's mirror had not made everything new. It had given me a lens. By the end of the second week, I had a small stack of moments that read like evidence. The tractor starting without merriment, a neighbor's unexpected help, Nathan's longer visit, Emily's stubborn appetite for crabapple, the tools polished and ready. None of this was miraculous in the sort of way people like to shout about. None of it was a cure for what had been broken. But the accumulation had a gravity. The little things were adding up into a mood that felt different. I kept the stranger's note in my pocket sometimes, more for the warmth of the paper than for anything else. When I would sit on the back step at dusk, the line would sit there under my thumb like a soft pebble. I am a mirror. I came to reflect what you needed to see. It was not an explanation. It was not an answer. It was, in its own way, an invitation to practice looking. On a certain cool morning, when frost had rimed the tip of the grass and the sky was that domestic blue you get before the sun breaks, Sarah called. I wasn't home at the time. Tom had roped me into helping with a flat roof, but I heard the phone ring in the truck and my hands fumbled like I'd not used them in years. I calmed myself down. I remembered the experiment. Find something that isn't wrong. When she asked how I was, I caught the complaint at its forming and changed the sentence. The roof held, I said, because we were on the subject of roofs, and then added, because practice feeds on itself, and the coffee tasted right. She made a small, surprised laugh that was almost like her old laugh when she was young enough to think everything could be fixed with song. We talked for 15 minutes. Nothing huge happened. We didn't reconcile every grievance or erase the years that had widened between us. But she said she missed the way Martha used to make apple crumble, and I said I had the old recipe, and I'd be glad to make a pie. The conversation closed without slamming a door. I am careful to tell you that these scenes aren't arranged for your benefit like a play with neat acts and final bows. Life kept being life. There were trenches of old hurt I had to cross, and sometimes I stumbled. There were mornings when I would forget entirely and find myself muttering like a man with a list. I would catch the complaining and feel ashamed, but then get up and do the thing anyway, bend over the tractor, lift the spade, and find that the small act of noticing repaired me in small increments. And so the days went forward, not in a straight line, but in a slow accretion. The tree, the tools, the note, the visits, they became less like proof and more like companions. The practice did not make my house an island of miracles. It made me notice the shapes of help when they came near. I had not yet picked the fruit. The green thumb-sized thing on the sill sat like a promise. Sometimes I would touch it and put it back because the waiting felt like part of the work. It was an odd discipline to treat a piece of fruit like a test, but there's a humility to waiting that growth insists upon. There was a night, a week after Sarah's call, when I climbed up into the loft and sat where the stranger had slept. The hay smelled the same, warm and slightly sweet. I pressed my hand into the straw and felt like a man who had been given a small, odd inheritance. I wondered if I would ever see him again. I wondered if he was some kind of angel or something less tidy. I told myself not to name him anything I could not own. He was mysterious. He was not ordinary. He was a mirror. That description fit better than any other I felt capable of landing. When I climbed down, the barn felt both hollower and fuller. Hollow because he'd left, fuller because something in me had shifted and left room for things to come. The 30-day practice still had days to go. So did my reckoning with the past. So did my hope for a little more of the life I'd been given. I walked into the kitchen, the note still in my pocket. The window light soft on the photograph of Martha. I put the note on the counter and sat down with the cold coffee and warmed it in the microwave despite my stubbornness at modern conveniences. I thought of the stranger's face, nodding in my mind like a new phrase. I thought of the way the tools had been polished, the way the tree had shown stubborn life in October. I thought of Nathan's laugh and Emily's sticky sweets. I thought of Sarah's tentative steps toward the house. I didn't know then what the rest of the month would bring. I only knew that something had been shifted by 3 simple nights and a small promise. I knew this. The practice had put me on a different path of attention. The barn no longer felt only like storage for my grief. It felt like a place where small confirmations could appear, not as miracles free of explanation, but as signs I could not entirely ignore. So I prepared to keep going. I made a new thermos of coffee in the morning. I went out to the barn to check the tools. I ran my thumb along the handle of a hammer and noticed how it fit the curve of my palm. I said it out loud, because the act of speaking had become a part of the practice. That fits. A little later than I'd expected, something else happened. I stepped outside into a sky that had washed itself nearly clean, and there, on a low branch of the crabapple, a single fruit had reddened imperceptibly toward a color that belonged to summer. It looked almost foolish in October, a brave, stubborn thing. I didn't pluck it. I breathed and recorded the fact like a witness. The moment felt small enough to hold. The rest of the month waited. So did the rest of my life. I felt both frightened and oddly steady, as if I'd found one more small tool to lay beside the others. There's more to tell. There are things that come and things that don't. There are reconciliations that start and stall, and seeds that take time to root. But the stranger who came on a stormy night had done what mirrors do best. He showed me where to look. He showed me where to look. The rest of the month did the work that months do. It slowly rearranged a life by doing the small, stubborn things again and again. When the days stacked up, each one claimed a corner of my attention and taught me what to hold. By day 15, the habit had teeth. I woke without immediately rehearsing a list of grievances. I noticed a sparrow on the fence line and said, "Good bird." It sounded foolish in the kitchen, like a man practicing a language he hardly used. The voice in my head, the one that had taken such pride in forecasting trouble, didn't like it. It muttered. I answered by touching the frame of Martha's picture and naming something that worked. The smile is steady. That countered the mutter with a small, honest weight. Nathan came more often. He'd taken to dropping by with tools or a bag of parts he'd found at the salvage yard. He'd say, "Figured this would fit," and I'd say, "That fits," because I meant it. The way we moved together changed. We were two people with shared history and separate hurts, but the rhythm of noticing eased how we handled the hard edges. We could argue about whether to dig the new drainage ditch this month or next, but afterwards we'd sit on the tailgate and laugh about how stubborn the tractor had been when we'd first bought it. Those small laugh lines were stitches. They didn't erase the cut, but they made it less raw. Sarah called again. This time she asked if I had the old pie dish Martha used. "I do," I said, and there was a moment when I expected the old script. Distance, coolness, a polite end. Instead she said, "I'll come by. I want to learn it the way she did." She came that afternoon, sleeves rolled up, hair in a tumble. She watched me measure flour with a kind of attention that made me remember her as a child trying to balance a spoon. When the pie came out of the oven, the kitchen smelled like the days before grief formalized itself into routine. She tasted and frowned in that way she had when she was small and picky. Then she smiled the half-smile that belonged to her and said, "That's Martha." The room shifted. Not everything was tidy. There were mornings when my knee complained loud enough to drown out practice. There were phone calls where the old complaint habit sat like a cat on my chest, hungry for the sound of my own grievance. I failed sometimes. I would catch myself mid-line and feel the shame. Then I would clear my throat and find something small to name instead. The falling into old habits didn't mean the whole thing had been a sham. It meant the work of changing took time and patience, not slogans. Tom and Marcus kept showing up for the small, ordinary favors that tie a neighborhood together. Tom brought over a bag of seed potatoes and insisted we plant a row. Marcus came with a new strap for the hay rack. Their visits turned the barn into something friendlier than a storage room of lonely objects. We did work and then sat with cold beer and the warm kind of silence that means a job got done. Once, when the sun hit the spade just right, I noticed it and said, "That fits." Tom clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You've gone soft, Hal." It felt good to be teased for new things. The tools continued to be an odd kind of evidence. They appeared in places I'd left them. Sometimes cleaned, sometimes just set, so the handle faced the same way my hand liked it. It felt like someone had been through the barn and arranged things with a slow, careful regard. I never found a witness. I only found the results. The screwdriver that had weighted the note stayed in the drawer. And sometimes I would reach in and feel the curve of its handle and think about the man who'd used it to anchor his message to my table. Day 21 came with its own small harvest. Emily, Nathan's little girl, decided my yard was an adventure course and spent a morning orchestrating imaginary rescues with the crabapple tree as the central post. She climbed onto the lowest branch and announced to no one in particular that she was the tree ranger. At one point, she picked up the green, not yet ripe fruit from the sill and held it up as if presenting it to a court. She tasted it, made a face, then another face, and declared it nice with the decisive authority of a child who has tasted the world and judged it worthwhile. She dropped the core near the compost and, later, helped me plant some bulbs along the fence. Her small, efficient joy was contagious. It rubbed off like good varnish. There were people who noticed other things besides me. The mail carrier asked if I'd been working on the barn, Because the wood looked cared for. A woman from town who sold preserves stopped and bought 3 jars of Martha's jam. She put one on the counter and said, "Your house looks warm." I found myself saying thank you out loud rather than muttering something defensive. Gratitude became less like an uncomfortable prayer and more like a tool for living. I still kept my guard up, but it had new hinges. The tree became my private calendar. Each new swelling bud felt like a small point on the map I was following. It didn't make sense scientifically. October is not the month for fruit to decide to brave winter. There are all kinds of sensible explanations: microclimates, late-season warmth, the stubbornness of old roots. I invited the sensible alongside the grateful. Both could be true. One explained the how, the other acknowledged the what. Life can surprise. By day 29, the feeling in the house was like holding your breath before a wave hits the shore. I woke that morning with a small ache of expectancy. It was not the same as hope. It did not promise outcomes. It was an alertness that something likely to matter was near. I brewed a pot of coffee and wandered out to the barn. Tools leaned, as if they had just been used. The screwdriver warmed the note beneath the bone of my thumb. I ran my hand along the hammer and felt the familiar fit. I said the phrase more often now, sometimes in a small voice, sometimes with a laugh. That fits. The phrase had become an honest ritual. I left the house and went to the crabapple. There were more fruits now than before, small green lumps along branches that on paper ought to have been bare. I cupped one and felt a give to it where before there had been none. It had softened, the skin under a faint layer of sun. I held it to my nose and smelled nothing dramatic, only a faint, clean scent of orchard. I thought of Emily's mouth, of her small declaration. On the 30th morning I woke before the rooster. The sky was a thin, hopeful gray. I made coffee and took it with me like a talisman. I kept expecting the day to be newsworthy, flashy, dramatic, headline-ready, and that expectation made me smile at my own vanity. This practice was not about a moment of revelation from on high. It was about noticing the small things that already were. Still, something in me wanted a tidy finish. That's the way our lives are taught to be. Neat endings, clear moral. Real life rarely offers that sort of courtesy, but sometimes it offers a fruit. I walked to the tree with the coffee cup warming my hands. The morning air had a clean edge that felt like a page. There, on the lowest branch, hung a single fruit that had taken on a wash of sun, red bleeding into green as if summer and fall had argued and left a compromise. It looked ridiculous and brave. It looked right. I picked it. It didn't make a sound. The skin gave easily between my thumb and finger. I brought it to my mouth like a man bringing something sacred to his lips and bit. The flesh was crisp, a tiny explosion of juice and something like summer's memory. I tasted sweetness and the suggestion of tartness. And then something older. Recognition. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. I sat on the step of the barn and chewed slowly, like someone tasting an idea. When I swallowed, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not a cure, not a grand fix, a clearing. A small permission to live with fewer rehearsed complaints cluttering the morning. When Nathan came by that afternoon, he found me rubbing my thumb on the spot where the fruit had been. He sat with me and held his mug in both hands and said nothing grand. We talked about planting garlic and the best way to prune a pear tree. At some point, somehow, the conversation turned toward Martha, and we told a story about the time she insisted the chicken coop paint be egg white, and then later covered half the fence in it. We laughed until our sides hurt. I felt what could be called peace, although that is a big name and I use it sparingly. It was contentment that had earned itself by repetition and patience. The months that followed were not a straight line upward. The practice survived because it was small enough to practice and broad enough to matter. I still had nights when grief pressed up close and heavy. I still argued with Nathan about drainage. There were times Sarah would call and then hang up before we could finish. Those things didn't disappear, but they no longer told the whole story. They were parts of it. One spring afternoon, about 6 months on, a strange thing happened that I suppose, after the stranger, I was no longer quick to reduce to coincidence. The county fair had a small exhibit on heirloom fruits, and a woman from town recognized the crabapple and came by with a wrinkled photograph from her notebook of a tree that had fruit just like mine in the middle of October. She laughed and said, "Happens sometimes with a late bloom. You got luck, Hal." I smiled. There's a generous kind of luck that tastes a lot like attention. I let her call it luck. Emily grew like a plant in a sunny spot, small, efficient, sticky with jam after a jar or two. She became my official assistant at planting time. She announced, with the verbal diplomacy of someone who knows her own authority, that she would be in charge of watering duties. She was dependable in a way that made me proud. She also asked for stories about her grandmother, and for the first time in a long while I found myself telling them without feeling like each sentence was an act of preservation. It was natural to say Martha's favorite recipes, her knobby hands, the way she could find a lost coin in a haystack. The stories became less like sifting through relics and more like setting a table for someone who would sit at it. Neighbors brought extra produce in the late summer. We shared this and that at the back gate like a small economy of kindness. Marcus brought over a bottle of something he swore was almost moonshine, and we used it to toast the first ripe tomato. Tom built a new gate and said, "To new habits," and I clinked his cup with my own and said, "That fits." The phrase had become both joke and truth. There were those who remained skeptical. A cousin from town called and said, "So you're saying a man showed up and you cleaned your barn and talked nicer?" I told him the story like I had told you, no more, no less, and he laughed, the kind of laugh that keeps distance in place of curiosity. I don't resent skeptics. They keep me honest. My life's changes weren't intended to be a demonstration for anyone but me. Still, I'd be lying if I said the change wasn't pleasing to share. A year later, the house held more noise than silence. There was laughter that belonged to different people, and a stack of small boots by the door. The tree kept its stubborn business and yielded a season of fruit that made a proper pie that autumn. I had friends who would come by to sit on the back step and watch the light shift without feeling obliged to fix one another. We had disagreements, then fixes, and then more attempts at being neighborly. The barn remained a place where small confirmations would appear. Tools gleamed at odd times, and I would find myself running a thumb along a handle and thinking of a stranger who had slept in a loft and said things that were both ordinary and impossible. What did the stranger want? I think he wanted me to practice looking. I don't know if he was an angel or a man or something else. I used to play with all the labels: angel, traveler, mirror. None of them felt essential. What mattered was that something not ordinary had passed through my life and left behind a practice. He'd written it plainly: "I am a mirror." I came to reflect what you needed to see. That line sat in my pocket like a charm. Sometimes I would take it out, unfold it, and smile at the carefulness of the handwriting. It didn't claim to explain everything. It claimed to invite. If you're listening and this lands on you, the cold coffee, the empty chair, the long rehearsals of grievance, try the 3 days. When a complaint rises, find one thing that isn't wrong. Say it out loud. Say it in your head. Fold it like a small seed and plant it in the day. It's not a guarantee that your world will suddenly rearrange into perfection. It's a small experiment. It's a way to re-angle your gaze. I tried it because a soaked man told me to, and because a part of me was tired of being the most articulate pessimist in the room. If you want to try it, start small. Tell yourself 3 days. Keep it as an experiment, not a verdict on your life. Notice anything that changes. Sleep might soften. People might answer differently. You might catch yourself saying, "That fits," and mean it. Or you might not notice anything at all and still have learned the value of watching. If this story moves you, and you want a few practical ways to start, simple prompts for the 3 days, a small journaling practice, a checklist of everyday things to notice, there's an optional resource linked in the pinned comment where you can download a short guide. It's modest and meant to help those who want a little scaffolding. No promises, no miracles stamped with guarantees. Just tools I found useful. If you try the 3 days, come back and tell me what you saw. If you want more, there are a few more reflections there and a gentle invitation to work through the practice with others. If not, that is fine too. I keep the stranger's note in a small box now. Sometimes I take it out and read the line aloud. I am a mirror. I came to reflect what you needed to see. It's both an explanation and a kindness. It reminds me to look for what works. It reminds me to name it. There are mornings when I still fail. There are still nights when grief sits heavy and the old scripts want to run. But now there's another voice with equal weight, quiet, practical, that asks me to notice the kettle, the way the light hits the table, the fit of a strap in my hand. That voice has saved me from a few useless arguments and has coaxed me into a kind of presence I didn't think I had left in me. If you come by the farm in late October, you'll see a crabapple tree that some people call stubborn and others call a small miracle. You might see a ladder leaning against my shed, and Emily collecting the last of the season's fruit. You might hear Tom telling a tall tale and Marcus shaking his head. You'll probably find me on the back step with a mug in my hands, saying things out loud that used to live only inside my head. You'll hear me say, now and then, "That fits," and I will mean it. I still think about the man who knocked at the gate that night. I thank him in my way, quietly, sometimes with words, sometimes with a jar of jam left on a stranger's doorstep. I never caught his name. I never asked for it. The mystery is part of the gift. He was and is a mirror. He came in the storm and left a practice that changed how I looked at the world. If you want to start, try the 3 days. If you want a little guide, follow the pinned link. And if this story has touched something in you, consider subscribing. There are more stories here, and I like to think they're useful in the slow work of living. Not promises, just invitations.